So I was going to, actually, I'll get to the copyright in a sec. I actually did want to respond to this notion that if it's anything to do with the internet, it's got to be global. And I actually argue that it's just not true. Because it's true if you were talking about regulating the network in a certain fashion, but that's not really what we're talking about here. Countries do have policies that seek to deal with things that happen online that can make a difference. For example, the United States has what's known as CDA Section 230, which grants a certain amount of immunity for a third party when things are posted. So you're creating a Yelp or a site that encourages people to make comment, and you're not going to be held responsible for defamation or otherwise for the stuff that other people post. We don't have that in Canada. And so our approach here for many companies is to actually take down the content at the first instance of somebody claiming that there's something wrong with the content that's been posted. That's something you can do nationally. Of course, China has its own ideas about what you can do nationally. So there's a spectrum of kinds of things you can do, and then there are other countries. France has its own ideas too, right? They want to kick off subscribers after 3 unproven allegations of infringement. So there's lots of things that do happen nationally. So I think it would be a mistake for Canadians to think we can't do anything here. I think if we're talking about a national strategy, it's about thinking about what kind of rules might make sense to try to help promote and facilitate that innovation. I want to just very quickly, I'd love to get into a debate about copyright, but this notion that we're dealing with a 100-year-old law, Sonny, you know that's absolutely not true. Well, we are dealing with a law that was fundamentally changed in the 80s. It was changed again in the 90s. You were directly involved in retransmission of new media, the Jump TV stuff, which also led to changes just a few years ago. So there have been regular changes. And what is described as updating this so-called outdated law are themselves outdated provisions around trying to lock down content. I mean, it's stuff that's now more than 10 years old around DRM.
Sonny, them's fighting words.
Well, I think that it goes back to what I said earlier about sort of taking a holistic approach. The reality is we do have a patchwork law. We have 2 ministries in Canada that typically don't get along, heritage and industry. In fact, they've not got along at various levels of the bureaucracy in a more personal way than one would think. They are both given charge with updating copyright laws. They are thinking and looking at this thing in a vacuum. You have the CRTC that is dealing with broadcasting and telecom policy, or partly policy. You also have industry, which is dealing with telecom policy, and then back to heritage for broadcasting policy. So when it comes to actually making, sort of updating the copyright law, you have a select group in each ministry that attempts to work together. They don't do that very well. Some would argue they don't consult very well. And that results in amendments that have come out over the past 100 years. And we're building effectively additions to the House, except those additions now are getting a little bit shaky, which is why we can't come to any consensus about, I think, passing any new amendments. We just need a bigger approach, a rethink. Is it possible? Am I dreaming in technical? Maybe, but I think that should be the goal. Sort of a fundamental rethink, is this right? Does copyright work in this environment? Is it what we need for the future? I don't think we've had that debate. Sarah?
I think the kind of regime, though, that we need in Canada has to really recognize the range of kinds of rights, including open innovation, and the right to free speech, the right to quotation. I mean, I believe content producers have to be able to make money, but the problem is that the kind of frameworks that are being imported from the associations from the US lock down rights and in fact go after some of the most creative content that's being produced, which is remixed content. And all you're going to have is a situation where young, very creative engineers at some of our best universities are going to spend a lot of time figuring out how to break the next system. So I think what we need to do is really look at a regime that allows, for example, services to sit on top of copyleft content, or copyleft's a little bit too radical, open innovation content, where it's the content is free, people can remix it, can use it. You have also the ability to fragment content and pay in very small amounts. But if you look through the rights legacies, remixed content would be impossible, and you'd just be going after young creative people who really we want to encourage to become the next generation of producers. So we need a very different regime than the one that's being proposed.
Dave?
Yeah, I think Sarah makes very good points. We were just actually discussing last night about how the astonishing creativity of remix and mash, where you take something and you create something that in no way resembles the original. That's the very exciting part, and I agree it's very difficult. There are a number of mechanisms. I just actually want to just make a comment. When Michael was talking about what you can and can't do in controlling, I really want to get very clear the point that in Canada there is very little intrusion. Essentially, with the exception of whitelists and blacklists that are organized on a worldwide basis for child pornography and cybercrime, there's hardly anything goes on here. So I don't want you to get the impression that we all sit around deeply inspecting packets with tweezers, watching what Canadians do. We haven't got time.
I think one of the really interesting points in the TELUS position is looking at the next spectrum auctions, and one of the disappointments from the last auction was that the money didn't flow to research in Canada. We really need to keep bolstering our ability to think about new technology and new forms of content. It didn't go towards educational institutions to help to really build the next group of young creatives, and it actually didn't flow to bolstering the Canadian digital content regime. So I think that rather than thinking about a tax, we should really look at those auctions and how to use those as instruments to build capacity within our industry. I don't know if you want to pick up on that.
Well, let's pick up on it before that point's made, Dave. Let's go to our audience, and should the government be using the proceeds of those auctions to directly fund digital media content and related, or should it leave it to market forces? Should it do that? Let's see who agrees. Let's most importantly see who disagrees. You disagree. Why do you disagree? You.
How do you decide who gets the money? Like, what about, like, sure, you can give it to CBC and all the big shops, but what about the small shops that produce really good content that don't get recognized? And by the time you split up all the proceeds, people are going to be getting like $10. Is that really worth it? Is it worth it to go through all this effort to give funding to like the content producers when there's so many of them in Canada that are either going to get left out and left behind and then are going to start a fuss about it, or if you give it to everybody equally, it's not worth it?